Hancock from the University of Salford, and Dr. Susan Pirate, who is going to be introducing our questions. I just wanted to remind everyone that our next lecture is Tuesday, the 4th of December, and it's at the Art Workers Guild, and not here. And the programme says Thursday, the 4th of December, it should say Tuesday, so ignore that, the date is right. And that will be Sir Peter Wright, the choreographer and director. He's going to be talking to Jane Pritchard, MB, who is curator of dance at the V&A. So please join us for that. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pirate.
Welcome everybody. I see that we've got people from different walks of life who come here for different reasons to hear about different things. What Jo does, well, there we go. There you go, we knew that would happen. So I've known Jo for a while, first as my MA student, and then as my PhD candidate, and she's gone on to quite a career at the University of Salford in Manchester, and her book just came out, Interdisciplinary Practices Research?
Intermedial practice.
Intermedial practice research. Intermedial practice and research. Intermedial, that's an interesting word, keep that in your head. What the hell does that mean? Which is what we're going to learn a little bit about tonight. Her book is really at the forefront of this field. You may be aware of the conversations that performance or theatre has had for years, or you may have gone to a piece of theatre that uses media in one way or not. Often the conversation around media is whether something is filmed, is it live, or is it not live? We've had that conversation since the 80s. We've also had the conversation of, is it live, meaning I'm here talking to you with my heart beating, does that mean I'm more valid and meaningful than if it was filmed and stuck on the wall? And what happens when we get Robert Wilson and other types of theatres where they're both live and not live? What's got more validity? But then when we get to the world of the digital is just a bunch of ones and zeros. Is that really meaning anything? What's the author of that? If you take a photo, what's the original? Is it the negative? We don't have negatives anymore, we're digitals. So is it what makes what we see? So that conversation sort of happened in the 90s. When we get to the noughts, we're sitting there going, does the digital or does media or does it perform in and of itself? And any of you that play on Facebook or have a phone know that the media does perform in our life. It plays another role. Sometimes it joins us, sometimes it separates, sometimes it defines us. So in a way it performs on us and we perform on it or with it. What Jo has done as somebody who has been working in performance and entering into the problematics of media and intermediality, and she's done something very special that I can't explain, which is why she's here. She's opened up the conversation in a brand new way that I think is one of the most valid conversations we could have around this going forward into the middle of the century. So Jo, take it away.
Thank you. So thank you very much to Harriet, to the Society for Theatre Research for inviting me to speak here. I'm really glad I finally made it. This was originally scheduled for March. The beast from the east hit, and therefore all was cancelled. So it's great to finally be here and making this lecture. It means a great deal to me that Experience is here, and I want to thank her very much for chairing and introducing. She, as she says, has been my research mentor from the very beginning, and so it's great that she's here, and I thank her for being here. So, to begin. As this lecture, despite its title, will elucidate quite clearly, I'm not someone who celebrates all things digital, who revels in data and wallows in networked connectivity. Indeed, I often feel split in relation to the digital world, such as it is, particularly social media, and what I perceive as a turning inside out of the self through excessive online sharing. So in that particular spirit, I thought I would start with a quote from Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle. In this section, a character called May has joined The Circle. For those of you who haven't read the book, this is kind of a quite terrifying near future vision of an amalgamated Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon. And as part of that company, she's learning the power of sharing, and specifically its value in raising her party rank. which is what the circle used to measure her participation. So this is a quote from the book. She posted 33 comments on a product test site and rose to 2009. She looked at her left wrist to see how her body was responding and thrilled at the sight of her pulse rate increasing. She was in command of all this and needed more. The total number of stats she was tracking was only 41. There was the number of friends in May's outer circle, 762. There was the outstanding requests by those who wanted to be her friend, 27. There were the number of songs in her digital library, 6,877. There were the number of artists recommended to her, 3,408. There was also the temperature inside the building, 70. The temperature outside, 71. And there were the number of people who'd viewed her profile that day, 310. And the people who'd spent an average of 1.3 minutes. It occurred to her in a moment of sudden clarity that what had always caused her anxiety or stress or worry was not any one force. It was not knowing. So what I thought I would do is I will respond to May's fictional data with a little bit of data of my own, which will probably give you a little bit of insight into my social media practices, such as they are. I have one Facebook account, which I've had for probably 10 years now. I have 339 friends, because I find it very hard to refuse friend requests. And I've posted a status update probably fewer than 5 times. Ironically, I see that most of those updates were posted at a time of great grief and sadness, when some of my customary reserve in social media spaces was eroded and worn away by those stark and sharp feelings. I've rarely posted anything since that time. I use the direct messenger function to communicate with friends. I sometimes like something when someone shoves it under my nose or calls me out as I see it through hailing me in a post. I respond briefly when people wish me happy birthday on Facebook, but only because a friend told me that it was rude not to. I never wish anyone happy birthday on Facebook. I'm commonly what is known as a lurker. Well, that used to be true until I stopped using Facebook or any other social media altogether. However, I do have a YouTube channel. And that YouTube channel has 9 subscribers and a handful of views. My friend once laughed at me for that, and even more when I said I didn't really want people to look at what was on there. I've also still got one Twitter account somewhere with 15 followers, one of whom is my brother and another my partner. I've tweeted once, under duress. So, the point being this: I'm hardly a cheerleader for networked or digital practices. In fact, social media exchanges in general make me feel queasy, furious, exposed, frustrated, vulnerable. Hence the adjustment in my practice in response to those feelings. Conversely though, I am also a practitioner who chooses to engage in digital possibilities. I'm somebody who has found in digital technologies a way of performing and being present in a live event, a channel, a set of openings and expressions that for whatever reason I could not access through or find within my physical body, its capacities and presence. You see, digital technologies are like a creative prosthesis for me. They allow me to escape, exceed, and reflect myself. But they also allow me to redirect, deflect, and defer meaning and attention and presence in performance. They are what Antonio Damasio refers to as my motives, which according to his model prompt, this is a quote, the detection and diagnosis of homeostatic deficiencies and help to identify desirable states worthy of creative art. So Damasio describes homeostasis as, quote, the powerful, unthought, unspoken imperative, whose discharge implies for every living organism, small or large, nothing less than enduring and prevailing. So how we endure, prevail with, through, in relation to, and perhaps even despite the digital technologies we have made, is perhaps then what is at stake here. And I think my point throughout this lecture is that my own practice as a digital performer was born out of a set of often unspoken, sometimes unthought, but quite powerful feelings that emerged through a set of playful, exploratory engagements with those technologies. And those felt engagements, they sit alongside my everyday anti-social media stance quite happily. They happen in and through different parts of me, for different motives prompted by diverse feelings about the positioning of those technologies in my existence. So the relationships that I form when performing with digital processes are really quite distinct. And they open up something about the digital that I don't have access to in my everyday interactions. And actually, as a performer who generally improvises, with making mixes of sound, image, text, and object on the fly, in practice, I'm really led by unthought and unspoken feelings and responses to moments of ongoing live performance. So this in turn generates networks of feeling within the performing practice, and they emerge at the intersection of the digital and the biological in effective threads and strains that for me are particular to the type of intermedial and digitally enabled performance practice that I make. To be clear though, we're all digital, aren't we? Well, to one extent or another, though clearly digital technologies are dictated, our access to them, by geographical and socioeconomic inequalities, and there's a digital divide still very much evident in many areas and demographics. Responding to, I suppose, what is our more privileged context, where digital practices and technologies are embedded in our world and entwined in our lives, the writer Lawrence Scott describes in his 2015 text, The Four-Dimensional Human. He says the fourth dimension doesn't neatly sit above or on the other side of things. It isn't an attic extension. Rather, it contorts the old dimensions. And so it is with digitization, which is no longer a space in and out which we clamber via the phone lines. The old world has taken on, in its essence, a four-dimensionality. And I suppose that chimes with a post-digital perspective, whereby the divides or the historical distinctions between the digital and the non-digital becomes increasingly blurred. So to the extent that to talk about the digital presupposes a disjuncture in our experience that makes less and less sense in the experience of the everyday. So that's from Berry and Dieter's book, The Post-Digital, it's called Post-Digital Aesthetics. And that kind of post-digital perspective basically starts with the idea that digital technologies are embedded in our existence, and then it looks at how thinking and creative activity might intersect with new digital norms in questioning and revealing ways that they operate. But maybe more of that later. We can't really be getting post-digital without some consideration of what we mean when we say the word digital. So Experience mentioned at the beginning the idea of binary code, or zeros and ones. And this is Peter Lunenfeld being quoted in Andy Lavender's contribution to mapping intermediality and performance. So he says, digital systems translate all input into binary structures of zeros and ones. And the great thing about it, of course, is that they can then be stored, transferred, or manipulated at the level of numbers or digits. Now that's a little bit contested, so I might come back if you want to other definitions of digitality. But I think moving on, Charlie Geer, whose kind of influential 2008 book about digital culture, points out that actually it's not just about the effects and possibilities of a particular technology. When we say digital culture, we're talking about the ways of thinking and doing that are embodied within that technology and which make its development possible. And we can add to that, following the Damasio idea, it's not just ways of thinking and doing, it's actually ways of feeling that are prompted by digital technologies, and indeed, in turn, make the development of digital technologies possible, as what he calls motives, monitors, and participants in our negotiations with digital processes. So, here we go with Damasio's motives, monitors, and participants. So the motive prompts the intellectual creation. The monitor kind of judges whether we've been successful or we've failed. And then the feeling also participants in the negotiation of adjustments required. So he's saying that feeling is leading all of that kind of process. And I suppose my example is digital music, so MP3s and WAV files. And my motive for engaging with that type of music, that form of music, was the fact, of course, that it's so accessible. You can have all of your music together on one device, you can listen to it whenever and wherever you like. However, a monitor started to kick in when I was listening to digital music, and that was that I was aware that listening in that way changed the way that I was listening to music, and I didn't like it. It didn't feel good to be restlessly flicking through tracks on an MP3 player rather than sitting down and listening to an album properly. Equally, there were some things I actually wanted to own, music that had not just passed through my life as a compressed stream of zeros and ones. So the negotiation is, yes, I still listen to digital music, but I also do sit at home and listen to records as well. And I suppose that's the way in which that particular kind of engagement with technology has developed. Returning then back to the post-digital. A crucial part, I would argue, of our feeling relationship with digital technologies on a day-to-day basis is ignorance. And that most of us experience that in relation to what our digital devices and processes are actually doing. And this is also talked about by people like Berry and Dieter in their book about post-digital aesthetics. In fact, what they say is computation is actually an infrastructure that performs a logic of impalpability. That is, that it is imperceptible. The machinery of computation is not clear to us at all because of the veneer that sits on top of it. And by veneer, we can think about all of the different user interfaces that we might engage with on a day-to-day basis, which mask what's going on underneath. They also talk about the fact that machines, and particularly machines in a kind of computational way, materialize what they call the spectrality of algorithms, which I love as a term, because it gives that sense that the kind of code and the algorithm that sits underneath the digital interface is one that's ephemeral, it's ghostly, it's imperceptible. And therefore, we're led to this state of amniosis, or not knowing. That we are facilitated in a systemic production and maintenance of ignorance. So to kind of demonstrate that, they put in their book this quite nice image, which is quite too large there, of a digital iceberg. So there we go. At the top, we've got your user interface, your screen, your surface. There's bits underneath that we usually a little bit more abstract that you can see. So usually files, folders, databases, lists of things. Sitting just underneath that, not too deep, is codes and algorithms. And then there are deep digital structures, low-level code, microcode, and right underneath at a forensic level, there are actually electronic signal structures which are happening, which enable that technology to work. So for me, that digital iceberg, which is very present for me, I don't know a lot about coding or programming, though some people clearly do, that creates for me a litigiousness on the edge of feeling. It creates precariousness, uncertainty, and sometimes a quite delicious instability. And that felt an ongoing negotiation with the hidden aspects of the digital is an oscillatory trill that sits at the heart of my relationship with its use, both as a creative practitioner, but also in everyday use. So really, is digital technology that different from what came before? We've always had technology in our lives, and it's always kind of evolved with humans as they have evolved through time. Well, yes, there are some arguments that it is extremely different. For instance, Mark Hansen talks about digital time as a new temporal reality in which human beings temporalize in conjunction with and on the basis of largely autonomous technical inscriptions of time. So you can think about the way in which the speed of a browser search conditions the way in which you understand and experience time, or the fact that when you press directions on Google Maps, it gives you an amount of time it's going to take you to get from one point to another. You are kind of experiencing time in relation to those processes. He also talks about the distinction between our lived affective temporality of human experience and then a more intensive machine processing time. And apparently digital processing is so quick, it is literally beyond our experience. What else? Well, the biggie, I suppose, is that it seems that we have, through the development of network technologies, produced existence where we are living a lot of our world and our time online, and that in turn means that we produce a lot of data. So when Web 2.0 kind of emerged, and there was a lot of kind of more interaction on the web, conversation, user-generated content, what tended to happen is the sense that this is great, there's a democratization of experience. But at the same time, in a post-Snowden era, we can think about big data, data harvesting, and data valence. And then there's a guy called Madawi who was writing in The Guardian in 2013, who said that today's factory is the human body. Instead of looking at people as consumers, companies are beginning to think of them as producers, emitting a steady stream of digital exhaust. And how that exhaust is surveilled, how it's used, how it's monetized, is kind of part of how we exist in the world today. I wonder what you think about voice in a digital world as well. There's a lot of arguments that voice has become less significant and less used because the primary means of communication in online world are messaging, text messaging, and images. And Sherry Turkle has written recently about her concern about the lack of face-to-face conversation, but even how voice has really kind of been, if not sidelined, then less used within our communications. And finally, we have those spectral algorithms, the ways in which algorithms are formed. They're human systems made by humans, but they are also used to represent us in particular ways. And Safiya Noble, in a recent book, argues that discrimination is embedded in computer code. The ideologies embedded in algorithms, visible and invisible, that we're reliant on, she argues, reinforce oppressive social relationships and enact new modes of racial profiling because of how they deal with and categorize our data, creating flattened and simplified identities. So enough about the digital. Let's move on and think about that in relation to performance. Of particular interest to me, given that context, are some of the diverse ways in which performance practitioners work creatively with the capacities of and issues associated with digital technologies. Now, I'm not speaking for all performance and all performers, but I am trying to understand from my own performing experience, through interviewing other intermediate practitioners and watching a lot of this work over the last 20 years, What A, the distinct interactions, assemblages and effects that are associated with performing with digital materials, and then B, what actually happens to digital materials in live performance that might be transformative of their capacities, their functioning and their feeling. In short, what are the networks of feeling between all those elements that are produced in this type of work? So I'm going to begin this section with a brief evocation of what it might feel like to be a performer who performs with digital processes. And that's included in the chapter I've written about performer in intermedial theatre for Mark Crossley's new book. So I'll just do a little bit of setup and then we'll be ready to go. You are a performer in a live event. You perform for an audience, though perhaps they're not in the same physical space as you. You perform with others who might also be present in different forms and modes. You perform through other elements. Your skill and craft is formed at an intersection with mediatized things, images, sounds, apps, digital processes in the form of binary code, algorithms, automated and generative happenings. Sometimes this means you have to hit a mark on stage to fit into an image that has been timed to appear there. Sometimes you are the on-stage technician, activating the technology as well as performing those activations for a present audience. Sometimes you might need to perform to a camera on stage and to an audience at the same time, or communicate with your audience through online messaging, or dance with a virtual partner. Sometimes you feel engulfed by the visual or sonic power of your mediatized scene partners. At other points, the very smallest shift of your presence can reconfigure how the audience experience the intermedial event that you are part of creating. So here I'm addressing intermedial performance practices. Intermedial theory focuses on in-betweens, points of connection, where different media, genre, practices meet, the nature of the between them. And specifically, I view intermediality in live performance as an active and lively conversation between developing doings within the live event as a whole. To be clear though, according to that definition, every performance is intermedial, and indeed it is. The actor who bears the signs of costume while being lit by the activation of the technician, the lighting designer, in an environment created by a scenographer, performing according to training, interpretation of the text, is always already intermedial. They mix their physical actions, skills, and approaches to the act of performing with visual, sonic, and material elements in a range of forms, which in turn, in their shifting and evolving state, constitute a live performing event. Equally, the vast majority of contemporary performances use digital technologies in one way or another, making the phrase digital performance just a little redundant. However, intermedial performance, I argue, is distinct in its more active consideration and implementation of digital technologies in the construction, the conception, and the presentation of the work, weaving their processes with those of the live performer. And the lively conversation between elements, which is always in process through an intermedial performance, I think reconfigures how those media function in the mix. Nothing is fixed or immutable here. So that very much links to Experience Brian's interest in paying closer attention to what she describes as the middle field of performing, practicing, activating. And the focus is on the doing, or the ways of doing rather, as process, as active, and as generative of knowledge. So if you think about this then, in that context, digital devices and processes could be what Experience calls prescribed texts, like a script or a score or a choreography or a set of instructions. When they then meet the performer's actions in that active middle space of performing, and the other elements and doings that are happening, they're made anew. They're refreshed, they're reinvented. They mean and they feel different in that space than they do outside of it, generating fresh affects and possibilities in that moment. And that then means that we look at the digital in performance not in terms of what it is and the technology used, but rather how it happens and the nature of the relationships formed between collaborating forces and potentialities. So, Catherine Hales has a really good example of this within a book that she's written about technogenesis. She talks about a distinction between something that's physical and material, so physicality and materiality. And she says materiality is an emergent property which can't be specified in advance. Actually, she says it requires acts of human attentive focus on physical properties, and therefore is a human technical hybrid. So what does that mean? Well, she offers a really good example of what that means. She talks about what it's like to work with clay to make pots. And she says that any idea of what she might have in advance of what that pot might look like is always modified and shifted in what is the middle field of making for her. And that means that a fluid dance at that stage is formed between what the clay has a mind to do, what the wheel does as it functions, and her own ideas and actions. The pot emerges between and from those processes as a material entity or a human technical hybrid. And I guess what I would say is, isn't that something a little bit like performing in the middle field with digital technologies? Because really, you can't analyze that performance through its parts, but really through how each of those different elements interact, what shifting possibilities are formed there, and what it is that emerges from that, when digital processes are active partners in a very particular way of doing. And perhaps that means that something exists in that moment of performing that is in process and not accessible outside the live event. For me, that's really exciting, because modes of digitality and digital engagement are made possible by live performance. It opens something up. I also think it's important, because digital processes in our daily lives, as I've discussed, are caught up in systems of power, sometimes feeling of impotence, and maybe a kind of collective shrugging in relation to the exploitation of our data and digital selves. If indeed the digital is made anew and happens differently within a live performance, different relationships, feelings, and understandings are also made possible there. So, a good example, I think, is a piece called The Believers Are But Brothers, which is by a theatre maker called Javad Alipour. And what you're seeing here is a screenshot of a WhatsApp conversation that was activated as part of that performance. So within this piece, Javad Alipour explored political extremism, digital technology, and male violence. He, as a solo performer, shifted between addressing us directly, taking on the roles of 3 different characters, playing a video game on stage, and then sending us messages through a collective WhatsApp group that also included all of the other audience members who could also, as you can see, add their own messages to that group. In the activation of this end-to-end encrypted mode of communication, which what WhatsApp is, which has resonances of terror cells, but also resonances of our kind of more banal exchanges with friends and family, something quite radical happened to my felt sense of the platform. and the content it activated and opened up. I think what it did was it opened up an experience and a politics of that platform and its intersection with the topic that Alipur was discussing, which would not have been possible, either without the use of the tech itself, but also without that happening in a live event, in the middle space of the live event. So there I am thinking, should I look at the phone or the performer? Should I add to the conversation? How do I feel about the messages that are being sent? Who's sending those messages? The felt confusion, ambiguity, and the dividing of attention from this insistent buzzing on my knee, which was part of how the performance happened, I think opened up a felt response both about WhatsApp, but also about the subject matter. And I don't think that would have been accessible outside the very particular conditions and doings of that event. And also, this is the final moment of the piece that you're seeing here up there. It kind of remains there, exists within that space. But when I read those particular messages, which were all sent by Alipur at the end of the event, I feel like there's a felt residue that persists in meaningful ways beyond the event. And I think that's what's important about the ways in which digital technology can be integrated into live work. So Damasio talks about objects and events. And in live performances, what these do is they play upon what he describes as the continuous and endless feeling state, or indeed mental choir, that underscores everything we experience. So he's kind of talking about the fact that you are always feeling. Everything that happens, you're always feeling in response to it. But when something intersects with that, such as a live performance of this nature, the interruption or the intervention is significant. It can create different qualities of valences of intermedial experience. So, moving on to the final section of today, where I'm going to talk about not necessarily being an audience member within performances with digital processes, but what it might feel like to be a performer a little bit more, and the types of feeling networks that are formed. What do you think might be the aptitudes or the affects that a performer working with digital processes experiences and then also needs to learn? It's true that in a lot of intermedial and post-traumatic work, the performing body, the actions of the performer, are part of a deliberately multiple set of happenings, and not all of those center our attention on the performer. And equally, with the growth of motion capture and motion sensor technologies, that can be taken further, in that the performing body can function really primarily, perhaps as just a trigger for something else to happen. A tool to generate another parallel set of technological events. So I've had some conversations with dancers, for instance, where they've talked about being suited up to be captured, their motion to be captured. And asked to move this or that way to create very particular kinds of sounds or indeed image effects. And that can be frustrating. Being a performer in that type of environment does feel different. And your capacities, your agencies, your sense of meaningful creative work can be affected by the relationships that are formed between your actions and those of the media, particularly when the feeling may be that one is in service of another. My experience of being an activating performer and technician in intermedial events creates ambivalent feelings. In the live works that I create, I manipulate sound and image, object and text in real time to generate shifting intermedial spaces. And it's true that when I perform, I'm very much in control of the intermedial combinations that are being made. Through the interfaces that I've chosen, the media are very definitely responsive to my actions. But that's not really how it always feels. Rather, there's often within these types of intermedial events a sense of being prompted, of being called, of being triggered as an element in the event by the digital processes and what they make. So that might mean that a shifting vocal soundscape that I've created might pull my action towards a certain image or lead some improvised text creation. And I've articulated that as a feeling of precariousness or instability. And that's created by being part of these sets of contingent, responsive, controlling, activating, and dependent actions with and through technologies in a live space. So my felt experience for sure leads the practice, but it also emerges at the intersection of the event, the improvised way of doing, and the very particular processes and interfaces and manifestations of the digital. Particularly its ability to modulate, to mix, to converge, to distract, to distribute, to cloak, to reveal. So this very much resonates, I think, with some key writing within the area, particularly that of Susan Cozell, who's written extensively about her experience of performing as part of the seminal telematic work by Paul Sermon, Telematic Dreaming. And here Cozell outlines the experience of performing with layers of technology such as projectors, digital imagery, pre-recorded and live film sequences, interactive sensors, and telematic links, is one of seeing yourself and others multiplied and spread across degrees of materiality. And the feeling of being multiplied, spread, dispersed, scattered is a common one for intermediate performers because of the capacity of the technological doings to reiterate, to loop, to stream, to modulate, and to play with the body's actions and presence and parameters. So I've got more examples of that then. I've interviewed some intermediate practitioners for the forthcoming chapter for Mark Crossley's book on intermediate theatre. And the things that emerge there, the two things that I'm really interested in are the capacity of live performance to playfully and provocatively intersect with digital technologies, creating these charged middle spaces where our understandings of the digital are shifted. But equally, different kinds of feelings, affects emerge for an intermediate performer who is at the coalface, as you might put it, of interacting with the digital in live spaces, and therefore, possibly, different sets of skills, aptitudes, and requirements are there. So in pursuit of that, I'm concluding now with an outline of what I think are some of the common intersections, relationships, and felt alignments that happen in intermediate performance, networks of sort. Perhaps with a question as to how some of these ways of doing might be productively embedded in training and teaching. So in many ways, this is now an attempt to make a more practical application of what's been quite a conceptual discussion. Let's see how that goes. So, first of all, a very, very common action for an intermediate performer is having to move and position yourself in a choreographed and predetermined way to intersect and align with pre-recorded images or video footage. And that requires of you as a performer a focus on timing, precision of an action, and a really heightened and sustained awareness of the physical dimensions of the space, the functioning and appearance of the image in relation to your body, and the angles of positioning of each, creating a precise choreography of body and image. And so good examples of this are Imitating the Dog, who do quite a lot of work with pre-recorded video and live performers performing against that video. And my absolute favourite example always, 1927, who used beautifully pre-recorded animation, which is then kind of placed in relation to live performance and a live score, creating these beautiful complicit kind of moments where the body just kind of intersects with the image. So digital rain comes down in the projection, the performer holds out their hand, somehow the digital rain is stopped on the hand. So those kind of intersections where there's this kind of causal relationship between the body and the digital process. What does that feel like? Well, I think it feels great and really satisfying as a performer when you can click into those types of composite effects that are created. I also think it's lovely, beautifully satisfying for an audience member, because I think what we see is an effect that's quite stunning in its kind of capacity, but equally you see how it's being made in front of you as well. So both of those things happening at the same time, I think feels good. Secondly, this is kind of more my area, I suppose. But sometimes as a performer, when you're an intermediate performer, you have to activate the technology yourself. So you are the on-stage technician. You sometimes have to mix elements like I do, but sometimes that's something about activating a camera like Rachel's doing over here. She's being the intermediate performer. And devices or apps or kind of online messaging and things like that. So as a performer, actually that does require at least a modicum of technological know-how. You have to know what the capacities of the technology are, how to zoom a camera smoothly, which buttons and sliders and mechanisms have particular effects. And if you're improvising, that means you always also have to be able to feel and respond to the developing event, as well as making it and activating it at the same time. So live media practices such as my own, or live coding, or live audiovisual performance are improvised ways of people using technology in that way. But also pieces like Katie Mitchell's intermedial work, such as Attempts on Her Life, or Waves, or Some Trace of Her. Because in those types of events, the performers work with cameras and props on stage to construct these beautiful intermedial moments, switching between performing and then technical facilitation of others' performance. I think, as I've said, I think it can feel quite precarious, vertiginous, on the edge of something unknown. And as I said, also within live improvised work, feels like you're being pulled and prompted by the affordances of the technology there, which can do so many things, and you have to choose in the moment what you want it to do. A very familiar trope in the theories around digital performance and intermediate performance is the way in which the performing body is doubled or divided or made multiple. And I think when you pull that apart, that often means that you might have to have dual purpose actions as a performer. You're performing for an audience present, but also for a camera, for instance, or you're messaging through digital technology while also being present within a particular space. The multiplying is about the way in which digital technologies create lots of versions of the self within performance through live feed images, for instance, vocal looping, avatars, and other technologized versions of the self. And then there's this sense that a lot of what you have to do as an intermediate performer is exist in this kind of divided attention. A number of aspects of the experience as it unfolds, which include technological processes and activations, but the audience, the user, the participant, and the event itself and how that needs to unfold. So in lots of ways, that's a lot of demands that are placed upon the performer. And you have to be able to manage multiple and diverse demands, a number of versions of yourself in play. So writing about 20 years ago now, Matthew Causey talked about the idea of encountering your digital self as being in some way uncanny. And he's written more recently to say it's not uncanny anymore because we're always encountering our digital selves in one way or another. And that's undoubtedly true. But I still think it's a little bit grey, a little bit strange, a little bit breathless when you're in performing and you do encounter that version of yourself. You hear your voice coming back to you, or you'll see your own image on the screen, or you're aware of yourself as an avatar or another version of yourself within the event. Finally, the kind of another trope of the digital world, I suppose, is that we are very much more responsive and interactive. And certainly an intermediate performer often has to have that at their fingertips as a set of things that they are able to do. You need to be able to respond often to other performers and participants, but through the media rather than necessarily in live spaces. So there's things that are involved in that which you need to be sensitive to the other performer or participant, but you've also got to be really sensitive to how your interaction is modulated, shifted, and enabled through particular technological interfaces. You have to know what are the best modes of communication that are suited to particular connections or interfaces. And you have to be open sometimes to the live possibilities of what that technology can do within an event. So Blast Theory's work is a good example of this. Their piece, I'd Hide You, when performers are running through cities and being kind of created as avatars in virtual mapping spaces that users can then kind of interact with and send text messages to. If you're a performer in that event, you're dealing with the technology that's here, you're trying to communicate with people who aren't here, you've got the people in the city itself, you've got a camera that you're trying to use to film that. So there's a number of different kind of things happening within that moment. And so it feels quite lively, buzzing, and sometimes quite invulnerable and exposed. In conclusion, there is no possible singular reading of the topic I've proposed, and nor would I suggest that there should be. But certainly what I'm discovering in my research are threads of engagement, aptitudes and meanings that are particularly associated with working with the digital in live spaces and in conjunction with an audience, participant or user. So perhaps on that basis, there is more we can do to think about how performers can be enabled to work effectively in these environments. What do they need to learn alongside more traditional skills of performing to adapt to media-rich environments? And particularly, not just the environments, but the different feeling networks that they will be part of when they enter into intermedial spaces. Equally, felt engagements with these technologies do have the potential to act as what Brian Massumi calls a shock to thought, where a body is forced to think by its implication in a self-propagating, serially self-organizing, generative movement, which is also a really beautifully apt description of the way in which live performing might work. So if you're forced to think by being implicated in that environment, then the careful play with and manipulation of the digital processes that are part of that could then create these transformative moments for felt engagement with the digital, opening up new effective engagements, thinking and possibilities. Thank you.
Wow. Is your book up there?
No.
Thank you, Joe.
My arm button.
Yeah.
Nice.
So. Get this book, not because it's mine, but Joe wrote a chapter in it. The chapter is the best one in the book. And it's corrected. Well, actually, Rachel's is good too. Different people. So, we open up any responses or questions that we have for Joe. Thoughts? Observations? I'm curious about your triangle. The top, the forensics. And then we get more and more and more to, my brain was thinking, this digital and technological stuff, and I'm old, it's mysterious. And then I'm remembering your word about the uncanny, which you said 20 years ago. And can you bring your last slide up? The doubling, dividing, multiple, the responses, the activity, all of that. You're talking about something that people don't talk about the felt sense, where you start with Damasio. And these categories, are these yours with your interviews? I could see why they're 4 categories, because they probably all have 4 different types of felt senses in them. I'm curious, if you've got that triangle and you go from the forensics, you can touch it as this, to the algorithms, which, well, I don't know what that is, and what is that digital thing in the sky, you know? I mean, here I am wearing a Fitbit, I don't know what the hell that's doing to me, and what I'm doing to it. I'm sure I'm in deep shit somewhere. But this, my question is, do you think that in each of these categories that the digital feels itself? Because now that we're feeling ourselves differently in the digital, is it possible that the digital, if we get to the top of that pyramid where we're less forensic, or if we get to the uncanny, is it uncanny or mysterious or further away from the forensic because it can feel itself? It's a crazy question, but people are now asking, does performance think, does philosophy think?
Well, yeah, it does. And if we're thinking about an expanded kind of sense of cognition, then yeah, it's thinking. It's got kind of a way of being in the world.
I can see these 4 different ways of thinking, too, not just 4 that it can think of itself.
But interestingly, in relation to that digital iceberg, I was reading Catherine Hales. I am a bit of a Catherine Hales fangirl, but I was reading something she was writing. She was writing about her. In fact, the title of the article was "Print is flat, code is deep," and she's talking about the really clear distinction between a piece of text as written on the page and the way it functions when you read it on the screen, and these kind of absolutely fundamental ontological things about what is happening as you receive screen print as opposed to when you read it in a book. And she was talking about the fact in relation to that, she didn't have a pyramid, she had an Oreo cookie. So the Oreo cookie was analog at the top, right? Analog underneath, because actually when you look at the electrical and silicon, that's all kind of stuff. And then in between, what she calls the frothy digital center, which I really quite liked. And what that is also about the fact that we don't receive things digitally. We receive them in the analog world. You know, when you are tapping away at something like that,
One iris goes like this.
yeah, exactly. There are things, there are processes, there are human processes happening there. But then I suppose that kind of like mystery or that uncanniness happens when you think about all the stuff that's enabling the other things that you receive through the interface. Now I understand.
I wonder who's in charge.
There's also a really other interesting article in The Guardian a few months ago now about how algorithms get out of control. You know, so the idea that they are human-generated kind of codes and principles that are being made to do particular things, and then somehow they are escaping their use. And they're going on to do things that their users and their people who made them never intended them to do. And that's in stock markets and things like that. So when that became algorithmically run, things were happening that were beyond the control of the people who put those in play. Now, my latest thoughts on this are to connect digitality to wildness. I'm interested in it as being something that's wild and out of control and beyond and kind of...
It's making me think of cancer, like cells that start splitting, dividing on their own.
Yeah.
And that's our big fear in AI and the big horror movies are that it'll get smarter than us and try to kill us.
I mean, I have to say that one of the things about that is, I don't think we usually think about that when we watch a performance with digital stuff in it. I don't think we really engage with that at all, unless somebody draws our attention to it. So there are performance makers who really kind of engage with that much deeper level of what the digital is doing. So Troika Ranch did a piece called Loop Diver, and it was quite a long time ago, but you know, they're always ahead of the game, Troika Ranch. And basically they made performers do a looped kind of action over and over again in competition with the digital processes that were also looping, in order to be very clear that we're not able to do it. So that looping of the sounds happening beautifully, timed like that, like that, like that. The digital, that's happening, the performers are just trying to keep up. And this kind of idea of the effective temporality of the human as opposed to this kind of very sharp processed temporality of digital is being kind of revealed through that piece. So there are people who play around with it much more than I do or am able to do. But when I look at the Mark Hansen stuff about the kind of deeper digital processes, I do think, well, do we really feel or think about that when we're performing with those kind of things, when you're holding that and it's being processed through, streamed and whatever, or are we just not able to? We just have to take it for granted that that's what's happening. So yeah, there's lots of thoughts there.
Any thoughts, ideas, questions? No? Sir?
Oh, sorry, in the piece you showed us about, and I feel I've forgotten the name of the performer, with the texting.
Yeah, I believe it's Our But Brothers, it was called. Yeah.
To what extent is that prescriptive, probably isn't the right word, but to what predetermined, shall we say?
That's the right word.
Yeah, totally. As far as I understand it completely, yeah, I think it was totally prescriptive and determined. But what wasn't was how the audience responded.
So he was able to manipulate them back into his frame?
Yeah, I suppose what he did was, and basically he did also prompt the audience, so he would say, what's the worst thing you've seen on the internet? And that was one of the questions asked in the WhatsApp group. And oh my goodness, you wouldn't really want to know what came up in terms of the responses, really kind of like, what? But he would then be able to, as a performer can, I suppose, in other ways, bring us back into the thread. And sometimes that was through a message on the group, and sometimes that was through doing something live. But it was all predetermined what he was doing as far as I could tell. But what he never knew was what people would kind of add to that conversation. And some of it was really full on, you know, I mean, it was quite intense. So, yeah, interesting kind of experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to, it's kind of results eventually in a question, but it's a very kind of a tentative thought. And just building on that, that whole idea of the pyramid, what I was thinking about a lot is that it seems to be like that it's kind of still evolving the pyramid, and there's this kind of a horizon, and that we are clearly on a journey from sort of using digital technology as a tool. Yeah. To sort of to it becoming a collaborator, and somehow that also changes what how we relate to the technology, and what else. And so what seems to me sort of what sort of emerges from your presentation and from your work, that there is still this kind of a sense of the performance being somehow linked to a skill and to using the digital technology as a tool, and that somehow that seems to be intrinsic to what it is as a performance. So what I wanted to ask, how you feel about that kind of a sense of this, of if technology through artificial intelligence reaches the stage of it being a collaborator rather than a tool, and will not require any skill from you to collaborate and produce performance, whether that will fundamentally change what you do, what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that more and more the sense of what the capacity of any kind of processes that you're using that you may tap or may not is growing, of course. So there are more and more ways in which things can be autonomous, okay, and can be generative without intervention from humans. I suppose the question then becomes, what is the function of that in relation to our understanding of this field of life performance? So what is it that we might be exploring through thinking more of the digital as the kind of instigator and the collaborator, and the performer as somebody who is kind of intersecting with that process? I think that already happens in some kinds of performance work. And I think that the paradigm shift, if you want to put it like that, it's certainly the shift in feeling that represents is quite fundamental, really. There are already kind of lots of interesting scholarship around robots in performance and artificial intelligence in performance, and the ways in which that is kind of something which is essentially kind of making as it happens rather than being directed to make or being used as a tool. And people are theorizing that sometimes in the same way that you might theorize what a child might do on stage or what an animal might do on stage. It's out of control in some ways. And that's interesting because, something could be happening with this artificial intelligence that you have not directed it to do, but it is happening and it's making something happen within the performance that may be of interest. And I'm certainly kind of interested in that element of things. I think still, naturally, we think, and I think performers are often in that way, and theatre makers are often in that way, they think about things that can create composite effect. They think about things that they can put together that will have meaning making or will have the potential to create certain types of experience. And then there's also stuff that's more like aleatoric practice or chance-based practice, where you very deliberately invite in something that you cannot judge or predetermine, and you ask that to be part of your process in some way to create a different kind of quality of experience. And I suppose that is really what we come down to, is how much do you open up to that and how much do you allow that to be part of the process? And then how do you reconfigure where the performer, if there is still one, in that kind of work exists, and what their role is. So I'm kind of raising questions rather than answering, but I think that it's...
Both of you, I was in Chicago a few weeks ago, my 10-year-old niece was having a fight with her Alexa. And it was the funniest piece of comedy I've seen in years. And some of it she had scripted because she knew what was happening, but then she was trying to show off, so she was doing big things, like she asked her to pull her finger and farted. I don't know how on an Alexa, I'm too scared to on an Alexa. I'm just curious, are there any performances with an Alexa, for instance?
If you're not, well, you should look this up, everybody, when you get home. There's amazing, somebody, a PhD student who presented at TAPA this year brought my attention to this, so thank you to his, I can't remember his name, but he introduced this. There is a video on YouTube, but it was originally in a different form, of two home speakers having an endless conversation with each other, because that kind of automative, generative thing happens between them, and it goes on and on and on. And somebody has put Vladimir and Estragon on each of them, because it has that kind of Beckettian kind of like pointlessness and sadness, but also joy and beauty to it as well. They talk about all sorts of things you wouldn't imagine. And they're kind of having these incredibly deep conversations, which of course are not, but equally they are on another level as well. And it's quite a beautiful thing, and also quite a funny thing to watch. So there we go, come and have a look at the home speakers have a conversation.
Yeah, so?
As a pre-digital dinosaur, before I become extinct, I have an observation, and I'm concerned really with the audience's response to this process. About 25 years ago, I was cinema manager. We opened one of the first multiplexes, and we experimented by showing a live relay from Covent Garden Opera House. At the end of the performance, you think the roof was coming off. The audience response was as if they were in Covent Garden, considerably cheaper, of course. That may have helped their response. 2 days later, we showed a digital version of that performance. And we still had an enthusiastic audience, but it wasn't half as noisy as in their reaction, their response to what they obviously thought was a film of an earlier performance. Now, are today's audiences, all you youngsters, have you been conned successfully, or do you still have this distinction between what you're looking at? I just leave that floating in the air, because we have to depart very shortly to deep and dark in Sussex. But thank you anyway.
Thank you, that was brilliant.
Work.
I just
Anybody want to
perhaps
respond?
in response to that.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is really a question, but I was thinking about it in terms of the uncanny and how we distinguish between kind of pre-recorded things and things that are live. And it's interesting sitting here when you were giving yours, because I could see what you were doing. And during the part with the Catherine and Hales clay part, I could see you drawing. So I could see you doing that, but I knew that perhaps other people couldn't see you doing that. So that kind of changed my perception of it, because I was like, oh, that's live.
Yeah.
But then that's not really part of what everyone else experiences. So I don't know, like, it's like kind of part of, I think you mentioned as well, people being able to see the kind of mechanics behind stuff, but then there's a weird kind of, I don't know whether it's kind of when you realise something is live or pre-recorded, it's a performance.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. And thank you so much, because that's a really interesting comment. Often when I have presented in this kind of way, people haven't necessarily realised that a lot of the stuff that you're seeing is being kind of activated live. And sometimes I do live writing that people automatically assume is just a pretense and is not actually live, even though I'm spelling things wrong and getting it all kind of mixed up. So I think the default, perhaps, from that very rubbish survey that I just did of people kind of watching, is that we expect that things possibly are masked, pre-recorded, Wizard of Oz style, you know, that kind of thing, the Wizard of behind the curtain that's manipulating something, but actually it's just a sham, it's just a show. But I do think, the same way that you experienced, that there is something different about experiencing something that you know is happening as you are experiencing it. It's just a simple, affective feeling that is a different quality of feeling. And I wonder also about your audiences in relation to that Covent Garden performance, and the difference between National Theatre Live when you know that the performance is happening at the National Theatre, and when it is a version that has been recorded and that you're watching. And somehow, why we listen to live radio when we kind of engage with that in a particular way as opposed to something that's pre-recorded. So there is, I think, a felt kind of quality to that means that you somehow have a different kind of connection with the experience. I'm also really, really interested in construction as a kind of a part of performing, like how things being made can affect the way in which you experience what is made. And I was really interested today to have that division as well, which is not one that I would usually have within kind of presenting work, where you had to make a very clear choice often whether you wanted to look at what the screen was doing or whether you wanted to look at what I was doing. And often in that kind of sense, there is something that makes you then think about what's more important or what's more.
Well, I have to make a real decision about what am I going to film.
And you have to do it in the moment, right? Yeah.
So kind of preempt, are you going to put something else on? Or should I go to this? No, it was good. It was really interesting.
Sort of kind of following on from this, a bit about sort of a question about the audience experience, because sort of related to that, in that, you know, sometimes when I have seen pieces that have live digital elements to them, and there's a difference between, or a different experience when it's really integrated, or when you can't stop thinking about how they're doing it, or you can't stop thinking about the technology behind it. And I think there's really, really, really different types of performance, because there's one that seems to be way more focused on demonstrating the possibilities of technology almost, and the other that seems to kind of show how the digital and human performance are one. And I wondered what your thoughts were about that. Like, this might be really obvious, but you know the RSC production, The Tempest, with the digital. Yeah, which I didn't see, and actually the reason I didn't go and see it is because so many people said, oh, it's just, you're focusing on aerial and thinking about it, and also it doesn't work that well.
And as I understand it, this was live motion capture.
Yeah.
So the performer was there, you could see the performer doing the movement, but you also saw this kind of very dominant digital avatar of the performer as well. So where does that sit in your, that's us seeing the construction, or that's the...
To me, that falls under the look what we can do with technology, rather than look what we can do together as performer and digital. Which for me, I don't enjoy look at the technology, because that's not what I look for when I go to the theatre or go to
absolutely.
But that is just a personal thing. I wonder what you think about the value of both.
I do like both. I really enjoy both. I think I probably don't like as much an in-between of that. So I love coming into a space and the tech is everywhere. All the stuff that makes it happen is there, and the wires are everywhere, and there's a very obvious sense of labour and construction and happening, and the kind of things that people are doing, which are kind of undervalued within performance, I think, which are the kind of how a sound kind of technician or somebody who's working with kind of activating things just at the right time in the right kind of way. That's stuff that is kind of fundamental to a lot of good performance that is hidden away. So I love it when that's all there. On the other hand, I also love it when there is that kind of magical composite thing where you're not really seeing the wires in the backstage and stuff like that, but what you're seeing is beautiful kind of configurations of technological and human. So the 1927 examples, I think, I always just love watching their work for the moments when the performer just kind of clicks into an image. And then all of a sudden, it's not an image of the body anymore. It's something that's happening together as a composite. And you wait for it, and you know it's coming, and then it happens, and you love it. But I still think that I'm still aware of the processes of that. Maybe that's because of the way, that's probably like, as you would be familiar when you're looking at performance, because you're not just watching it for an enjoyment, you're looking at and analysing, picking it apart. But I still think that there is a magic that's created in those kind of moments that is a kind of like a far away, beautiful kind of thing. It's not necessarily reflecting, of course, on any of the kind of more the issues of those technologies, but it is engaging in their capacities in meaningful ways to create, effects that are enjoyable and that create certain kinds of feelings. 1927's latest piece, Golem, is about kind of digital technology in a broader sense in terms of its content, and then combines that with those kinds of kind of more beautiful combinations of things. So yeah, I love both of them, really. I think what I don't like is what I hate, in fact, is when, and I don't know whether the Tempest example is a good example of this or not, when it's very obvious that there's just to throw a bit of image in there, or throw a bit of this in there, without really considering what the interrelationship of that is with the other things, and how those things work together, and what it's doing. And I think that's very obvious in some work when it's just kind of like placed within a piece. It's not integrated, or it's not causally related to what you understand is important within that. So I guess that's probably the middle space that I don't like.
So I've been thinking about principles from physics, quantum mechanics. You know, Schrödinger's cat. And I've been thinking about that in relation to the question that I had about the audience experience live or recorded, because first I know the idea of the cat that you put it in a box with a capsule of poison, you close the box, and you don't know if the cat's dead or alive. So for the whole time the cat exists in both states, being alive and dead. I think it's the same for audiences. I don't know if something's digital or recorded, it's live. And I get this whenever I go to see a production, and I've been told that they pre-recorded backing scenes. Yeah, the singers on stage are only performing. The people that are dancing as well, they pre-record it. That's ruined for me then. You know, the performance is it ruins it, because I now know that it's not magic computer gets it. I happen to work at Opera House, so I can vouch for our cinema program, it works very well. But you know, I know that all our performers that go on stage are especially single their natural voices, because I can see it. I'm backstage, I can see they walk on stage without their microphone on. I can enjoy the performance, knowing that I'm getting a really deep experience. I think it's difficult for audiences to know when they're going to see a production if they can trust what they're seeing or not, or hearing. It's trust, and I think we've ruined it because the commercial theatre is trying to build up their productions to make the audience appreciate it, which is very difficult to do because we're watching Game of Thrones and stuff on TVs at the moment. How do you compete with that? So the producers are trying to create big and creative productions, and as a result, they're broken the trust of the audience.
I think what's interesting about that is that there are points when this is the point, yeah, when the kind of the presence or the playing with our reality or sense of reality is part of what you're doing within a piece itself. But there may be other points where that is very much definitely to kind of like mitigate, as you say, against other kinds of circumstances. And I think, I mean, I'm interested in artificial processes in kind of performing, like the notion of how much lip syncing is kind of really become a practice in and of itself, which is really a very digital thing. It isn't, but then it is in some ways in terms of its current form. So how something that you might kind of consider to be a fake or a sham then becomes in its own right something which is quite beautiful and kind of artistic and quite affecting as well. Like when you see really incredible lip syncing and like it's and Tina Bausch's piece, wasn't she, where somebody was incredible lip sync. Then there's something about that that really is shifting and transformative. But I suppose if you're asking an audience to trust in something, and particularly if the trust is based on the kind of primary thing that is of interest perhaps in that audience, which is to do with vocal kind of articulation, power in the voice, and then that is being undermined, then I understand that then becomes something that's an issue. But I would hate the thought that then what happens is everybody just sits there trying to work out whether it's real or not, because that's not necessarily the way to go either, is it? I suppose it's like you have to trust.
Yeah, well, when we were here a month ago, the previous lecturer was Barry Rutter, and he was having a good old dig at the live from, and there's people showing Tom Hiddleston or someone doing live camera. And of course, you can do it. It's not live anymore. It's just on tape. There's any form of analog or whatever, you know. But they're still striking out for cinemas because it's popular.
Got it.
It's the shelf moment shadows everywhere. It's happening, which we did 3 years ago. They're still advertising enough for it as live from National Theatre. So you think, oh, you know, really?
Not really. Live from not really. Well, it's like, well, not really.
On that Tuesday evening, or has it since been edited and trimmed and tidied up, which is then becomes film and whatever?
I think what I'm excited about, because that is definitely a problem, like the authorities of real monetization value, you know. But what I'm also excited about in our postmodern world is that where we make explicit the labor, like if lip syncing is the labor, there it is, or where we take responsibility for the aesthetic, right? Even if it is not live. But you're right, when you're not taking responsibility for it, it becomes a problem. But this is what's so interesting about your work. You've got stuff all over the place, and then we can sometimes see you operate, sometimes not. People walk around her body and go, oh, she's doing that. Oh, wow. And then you can go over there and you can play with it when she's doing that over there, and then you never know. So Jo's work is amazing because you never know where she's actually situated in it. She lets you walk around her. It's sort of like going to a club when you've taken something interesting. Not that I've ever done. And it's beautiful. So it's really cool. I think we do need to end soon, don't we? But if you ever have a chance to go see Jo's work, go be in it, because it's not seeing it, it's to engage with it. And you can't really describe what the experience is until you do it. And that's why you're taking so much time experiencing what it means like to be in it, because it's sort of different every time. And then I'm sure you've got new technologies all the time.
Always with the new tools.
Yeah, that she does like her twice. Also the book, Intermedial Praxis, Practice and Research, is really worth a read. Jo has a tendency, which is very unusual for an academic, to write in a way that you'll understand. So it's worth it. All right, so thank you. And thank you.